taken across the Irish Sea. Will we ever be set free, my father?
Anyway, so without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Colin Veach, who's a senior lecturer in medieval history at the University of Hull. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So Colin did his doctorate at Trinity College Dublin, and he's worked at Hull for several years now. His first book, which you can buy over here, is Lordship in Four Realms, The Lacy Family, 1166 to 1241. And that explored the political fortunes of another aristocratic family in England, Ireland, Wales and Normandy. He's also most recently written a chapter in the new Cambridge Medieval History of Ireland, which is one of the most important works on Ireland that will ever be written. Not Colin's article, just Anyway, sorry, so Colin's talk this morning is entitled Disputed Isle, the Foundations of Mortimer Power in Ireland.
I'm Dr. Colin Veach. I'm a senior lecturer in medieval history at the University of Hull. My work explores the interconnected histories of Britain and Ireland placed in the broader context of Western Europe. Today I'll be talking about the context of Mortimer power in Ireland, how from the English invasion in 1169 the structures of power on the island were managed and sometimes directed by the English king and his representatives. This was not simply an issue of native versus newcomer, but it was a complex system which crossed the ethnic divide. You'll want to wait with that applause till the end. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the Mortimer History Society for inviting me here. I'd say congratulations on reaching your decade. From what I can see, it is certainly thriving. Now, my role here today, as I see it, is to sort of provide the context for Mortimer power in Ireland. Now, logic and conventional storytelling would suggest that I begin at the beginning with the English invasion of Ireland in 1169. But that would mean that you'd have to wait at least a half an hour to hear anything about the Mortimers. So I say logic be damned. Let's start at the end with Mortimer's commission as the king's lieutenant, and I'm sorry, I have to say lieutenant, I cannot say lieutenant. So lieutenant in Ireland in 1317. There is method to my madness because I hope that by exploring this episode, it'll frame my discussion of politics and power in Ireland. And don't worry, I will get to the invasion in due course. So, hope this works. Yes. Okay. So, the episode with which I'd like to start comes from the spring of 1317. Europe was entering its third year of a great famine, which put intense pressure on the population. In Ireland, the famine roughly coincided with an invasion from Scotland when Edward Bruce invaded Ireland in 1315. And he declared that he was King of Ireland. Roger Mortimer was a major landholder in Ireland already, having inherited the lordship of Dunamace, which, does this have a point? It does. Which is somewhere around there, shaking like a leaf. Look at that. Anyway, somewhere around there. And from his wife had inherited the liberty of Trim in Meath, just around there. He was the first Mortimer, or at least the first Lord of Wigmore to set foot in Ireland, and he had already played a part in the wars against the Bruces. He lost a devastating battle at Kells in Meath in 1315. It seems to be haunted. Roger does not like hearing about his loss at Kells. In November 1316, he was... All right, I can shout without this. Yeah, shall I? Is this now off, on? Okay. Right, here we go. All right, so in November 1316, he was appointed King's Lieutenant of Ireland and effective Viceroy to take the place of the King in Ireland. And this was to enable him to better combat the Scots. Now, unfortunately, this commission was made when Roger was still in Britain, and for various reasons, he couldn't actually get over to Ireland until the spring. Now, even more unfortunately for the English, the same was not true for King Robert Bruce, who was able to cross the North Channel and join up with his brother Edward Bruce in Ulster at the end of 1316. So the scene was set for a Bruce invasion of southern Ireland at the beginning of 1317. So, in the early months of 1317, the Bruces marched south. While they devastated some territories, leveled castles, and threatened Dublin, their ultimate goal on this journey was the Gaelic Irish kingdom of Thomond, down here in northern Munster. They had been approached by a pair of Irish dynasts who had promised them that if they marched to the southwest, that they would be met with an Irish army who would then help them go on their way and attack the English. As a result, the Gaelic Irish Annals of Inishfallen report that the Scots arrived at the River Shannon hoping to effect a junction with the whole Irish army. So since Mortimer was still in Britain at this time, there wasn't an effective force within the English colony, as I'm going to call it. We can talk about whether it's a colony or not afterwards if you like, but for simplicity's sake, I'll call them the colony and colonists. There wasn't an effective force. There was a justiciar. He mustered an English army, but they were too small to confront the Scots. So they arrived at the Shannon, hoping to effect a junction with the entire Irish army. But their hopes were misplaced. You see, in trying to in the drive to promote a national uprising amongst the Gaelic Irish in Thomond as elsewhere, the Bruces misunderstood the nature of political power in Ireland. Unfortunately for the Scots, their allies in Thomond were actually members of an ousted lineage who had rebelled against the current king of Thomond, Muircheartaigh O'Brien, or Murtagh O'Brien. I'm going to use the Irish forms, or try to use the Irish pronunciations as best I can, but there it is, Muircheartaigh O'Brien. So the Bruces' allies were actually rebels there, and who were using the Bruces to try and get the kingship of Thomond for themselves. And so there was no better way to ensure that the current king, Muircheartaigh, would oppose them than supporting these rebels. So instead, when they arrived at the Shannon, rather than being welcomed by the Irish with an army for them, they were confronted by an Irish army. And at just the moment that they realized their horrible mistake, Roger Mortimer also arrived in Ireland on the 7th of April, 1317, in southern Munster. And so he gathered together with the other English forces on the island and chased the Scots back north to Ulster. Because of the famine that was ongoing and the scorched earth policy that much of medieval warfare was in this period, the Scottish army was starving, they were bedraggled, and they had to limp back to Ulster with their tails between their legs. Now, what the Bruces had learned to their great cost was that national politics of the type that had united the Scots against the English were not natural were foreign to Ireland. While most of the Gaelic Irish might have harbored grievances against the English, and there were justifiable grievances against the English, and perhaps even supported the Bruces' cause, their responses were mediated through their local concerns. And so rather than producing some great conflagration of nationalist fervour in Ireland and uniting all of the Gaelic Irish against the English, instead the Bruces managed to ignite small fires throughout Ireland that were more easily quenched by the English. So how could such a fractured political society have been ruled by the English? I'm not asking you to answer. I will. That's a rhetorical question. And in short, perhaps it couldn't. Perhaps the best that could be hoped for was that the currents, the different political currents on the island could be managed or perhaps directed by the English crown and its representatives. So the first 150 years of English rule in Ireland was thus a period of factionalist politics, in which alliance and intrigue often cut across the ethnic divide. It wasn't simply a case of English versus Irish. Royal edicts were mediated through local power structures and required the acquiescence of local elites to be affected. This was the Ireland into which the Mortimers were thrust at the beginning of the 14th century, and which provided the context for their future successes there and perhaps elsewhere. So there you go. You got the Mortimers at the beginning. Now we're going to ignore them for some time and then come back to them at the end. So, to the beginning. This year marks more than a decade for the Mortimer History Society. It's also the 850th anniversary of the English invasion of Ireland. It began a political relationship that still survives in some form or another today, in the form of Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, it was not a foregone conclusion in 1169 that relationship would be so enduring. This is because while the context and character of the invasion may have been English, its ultimate beneficiary, Henry of Anjou, King Henry II, presided over a vast assemblage of lands, which historians call, or some historians call, the Angevin Empire. I'm one of those historians who calls it that, which is why it's on the screen. Now, in the Angevin Empire, at least at the very beginning, Ireland was no more constitutionally dependent upon England than England was on Normandy or Normandy was on Anjou. It was a province of this empire, if we can call it an empire, and I'm happy to talk about that too. And its road from Angevin province to English colony was a circuitous one that was not predestined, and it was the result of chance, opportunism, and in some ways, disaster. And I think this is important to bear in mind, because while I don't agree with historians who characterize Henry II and his sons as reluctant imperialists, jeez. Henry II's now turned up. Ireland was not the top of their agenda. And so this has to be borne in mind. So I will be banging on, and we might all be banging on about how important Ireland was. And of course it was. Of course it was. But the Angevins thought in terms of France, really. And so their mechanisms that they utilized for rule in Ireland, as in Wales and other regions that were not their top priorities, have to be seen in this light. And it's just very interesting that those bonds seem to have proved the most enduring, rather than the Anglo-French ones. So, one of the uncomfortable realities or facts of the English invasion of Ireland was that it began with an invitation. In 1166, the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurchada, or Dermot MacMurrough, who was King of Leinster, and the rugby fans among you will know where Leinster is. It's just there. Was expelled. He was expelled from Leinster by a coalition of his enemies, which included the High King of Ireland, as well as some of his own vassals. He traveled to Bristol and then sought out King Henry II, following him all the way to the Loire. Now, why would he have gone all the way to the Loire for Henry II? Well, Henry and Dermot were not strangers. You see, during the reign of King Stephen, the Angevins, when they were fighting for the crown, had used Bristol as their base. And that meant that the trade networks between Bristol and Eastern Ireland had allowed them to recruit mercenaries from Leinster, so from Dermot's kingdom. And just the previous year, in 1165, so I haven't forgotten about 1165, it is there, Henry had contracted the Dublin fleet, and he had to have Dermot's permission to do that. So he contracted the Dublin fleet for his expedition against Wales, where he tried to conquer Wales. So Dermot went to Henry and said, "Please, I will become your vassal." He performed homage, we think, and at least swore fealty, said, "I will become your vassal if you help me to conquer Ireland." Now, in the event, Henry didn't agree to help him conquer Ireland. He accepted his homage and his fealty, but then just gave him permission to recruit from among Henry's own vassals. Now the context for this is that 1165 Welsh campaign. So in 1165, well, how shall we say? Okay, from his coronation in 1154, Henry II tried to restore the crown of England to all of the rights that he thought it had enjoyed under his grandfather Henry I. The process culminated in some ways in 1163 when he had all of the kings of Britain, including the King of Scots, the kings of Deheubarth and Gwynedd, and, quote, all the great men of Wales come to him at Woodstock and perform homage. However, Henry's imperiousness in 1163 fed resentment, and in 1164 the Welsh revolted. So in 1165, Henry's response showed the scale of resources available to the master of the Angevin Empire. The Welsh Brut y Tywysogion reports that, quote, Henry gathered along with him a mighty host of the picked warriors of England and Normandy and Flanders and Anjou and Gascony and all Scotland, and he came as far as Oswestry, purposing to carry into bondage and to destroy all the Britons, that is, the Welsh. English sources corroborate this scale of recruitment and add in that he also contracted the fleet of Dublin. Now, unfortunately for Henry, his massive force got bogged down by inclement weather and difficult terrain, ran short of food and supplies, and had to limp home in disgrace. So in 1165, what might have been a conquest of Wales was actually abandoned. Now, at that point, Henry had more or less neglected his continental territories for 3 years as he sought to impose his will on all of Britain. So in 1165, once that ended, he left and went to the continent. And he then decided to compromise with rulers in Wales. So instead of trying to conquer, he accepted their fealty or homage and then agreed to act as arbiters in their disputes with marcher lords. So when Dermot approached Henry II at the Loire in 1166 and said, hey, come on, let's go to Ireland, Henry had no more time to waste on an inhospitable frontier. He couldn't see anything good coming out of it. He had other things to do in France. So he just allowed Dermot to recruit. Now, as it happens, Henry's position in Wales made Dermot's call for recruitment all the more appealing to Welsh marcher lords, who were now hemmed in by a resurgent kingdom of Deheubarth. So without the English king providing support, the Welsh were able to rally. They overtook some territories, and those marcher lords were given an outlet when Dermot came and said, listen, come with me, I'll grant you lands, I'll grant you honours in Ireland. And of course, the Welsh marcher lord who stood to gain the most was Richard Fitzgilbert, declared better known today as Strongbow, just like the cider. I don't know why they named cider after the man, but that's great. Cider's not great, but it's great to have a cider named after you. Dermot said to Strongbow that if he agreed to help him reconquer Leinster, he could marry Dermot's daughter Aoife and inherit Leinster at Dermot's death. And so this is what Strongbow agreed to do. The English, and they call themselves English. That's the reason I'm saying English instead of Anglo-Normans or Normans or whatever. They called themselves English as they went over. Even the Welsh marcher lords called themselves English. They could scream St. David, but they admitted they were part of a political community called the English. So, as the English came over in 1169, they helped Dermot to re-establish himself in Leinster. Dermot died in 1171, and true to his word, Strongbow succeeded to the kingdom of Leinster. This roused Henry II to action, who mounted a massive expedition to Ireland in 1171 and annexed it to the Angevin Empire. I would ask for questions, but deal with that. So, question mark. So what did the English think they were doing in Ireland? It seems a fair question to ask, because if we're going to look at what happened in Ireland after 1169, it's useful to know what the goal was. And conquerors tend to find the need to justify their conquests. The complicating factor for the English invasion of Ireland is that most of our sources before it were written after 1171. That is, after it was taken over by Henry II. And so what might have in 1169 been seen as an episode involving some minor, maybe major, but mostly minor characters from Britain was transformed into an island-wide annexation by the master of the Angevin Empire, ruler of all of Britain and 2/3 of France. As a result, and as other historians have pointed out, there are some distinctly imperialist characteristics to some of the justifications, the most prominent justifications that were issued. The emphasis in these was on alterity. Irish Christianity was different. Irish society and culture were different. Irish political structures were different. Most importantly, those differences were wrong and in need of correction. Now, there are several of these, but a few examples should suffice. In September 1172, Pope Alexander III sent 3 letters to the Irish kings, the Irish prelates, and to Henry II himself, which basically set his seal upon what was a fait accompli. He characterized the English invasion as a reforming mission. In Alexander's words, which may have mirrored Henry's own presentation of the event, because Henry sent his own messengers to the Pope for this purpose. Henry was in Ireland. There it is. Where is it? It was in Ireland to impose much-needed order upon a, quote, uncivilized and undisciplined race who have wandered unbridled through the steeps of vice, who have renounced all reverence for the Christian faith and virtue, and who destroy themselves in mutual slaughter. 2 decades later, Gerald of Wales furthered this narrative. He described pre-invasion Ireland as being an island full of tyrants, savage and religiously deviant rustics who, never having been successfully invaded by anyone, not even the Romans, were stuck at a lower level of cultural progress. Quote, "They are wild and inhospitable people. They live on beasts only and live like beasts. They have not progressed at all from the primitive habits of pastoral living." And just to show you, these illustrations are from an early 13th century version of Gerald's work. So here you can see one Irishman chopping another in the head with an axe, which is an impolite thing to do when you're standing on his back. And here we have, that is a goat kissing an Irish woman. I won't go into what that is meant to illustrate. Right. Gervase of Tilbury, last example, who, like Gerald of Wales, spent time at Henry II's court, thought the project a success. When describing Ireland to Henry's grandson, the Emperor Otto IV, in the early 13th century, he wrote, "This island used to be inhabited by Irish tribes until the time of the renowned King Henry of England, your grandfather, most worshipful prince. He was the first to drive out the pestilential tribes of Irishmen and turn the land into an English possession." Here, English, not Angevin, English. "And so it has come about that a land which from the earliest times was contemptuous of religion is growing strong in the new faith brought by the settlers." Okay, if you were my students, I would ask now, what is wrong with that statement? I'm not going to ask you. I'll tell you. In the early Middle Ages, the Irish had converted the English and the Germans. Otto's own empire was filled with things called Schottenkloster, literally Irish monasteries. I mean, you could, it's like, I was going to make a Trump allusion, but I'm not going to. We're not going to go political today. It's going out on YouTube, and I don't need that. Right. My point is, these are the words of some fairly loud voices, a pope, and 2 members of royal administrations. Recently, a few historians, including myself, have questioned just how representative they were of wider perceptions of Ireland and the Irish. For instance, Gerald of Wales tells us that he wrote his work on Ireland at the suggestion of Henry II, and he wrote it so, quote, The envious and thoughtless would end their vociferous complaints that the kings of England hold Ireland unlawfully. Now, you do not need to write such things if there isn't a backlash against the English invasion. So just because it hasn't survived doesn't mean that it wasn't there. So just a grain of salt with these. So Ireland was notorious, certainly, for its lawlessness and its political fragmentation. But when we look at sources not so closely associated with the Angevin court, this religious deviancy and cultural, horrible culture isn't as prominent. For instance, when we look instead at vernacular literature, we can see that persistent low-level warfare was actually quite attractive to aristocrats steeped in a culture that celebrated the display of prowess in battle. I'll use two examples. For instance, a desire to exploit this aspect of Ireland is clear in Le Roman de Horn, the Romance of Horn, a French language adventure story composed in England around the time of the invasion. It was later reworked in Old English as King Horn, if any of you have spent your days reading Old English. Basically, in the story, Horn is out of favor at the court. He's had his kingdom taken away. He's out of favor, and so he goes to Ireland in search of adventure. He takes up service at the court of a Dublin-based king of Ireland, but is sorely disappointed by a long period of peace. He simply can't fight anyone. And so what he does, he whiles his time in Dublin being better at everything than everyone else, as heroes in these stories are wont to do, and attracting the attention of the king's beautiful daughter, because of course our hero is very handsome. But finally, thankfully, the Saracens invade, and he's able to lead the Irish to victory, save Ireland, and as a reward is offered the hand of the king's daughter in marriage and succession to his kingdom. So this was written around about 1170. It's difficult to date exactly when it was written. If this does not parallel exactly Strongbow's situation in Leinster, and it doesn't, because actually in the Romance of Horn, Horn decides to shun his Irish princess and instead returns home to marry his beloved. It at least provides insight into a cultural paradigm where such a speculative adventure in Ireland was deemed possible. The Irish were not so barbarous that an Irish princess couldn't be seen as a great prize, and in the event, Horn doesn't marry the Irish princess, but his relative, who was already a crowned king in Europe, does marry her. So it's still seen as being part of the same socio-political arena as the rest of Europe. This is much the same view that one finds in the vernacular verse chronicle La Geste des Anglais en Irlande, better known perhaps as the Song of Dermot and the Earl, which is what Goddard Henry Orpin called it when he first published it. This was the story that the invaders told themselves. It was produced by and for those who took part in the invasion. And it presents the invasion as a response to the illegal rebellion against Dermot, the great king, the mighty king, pardon me, who was so liberal and courtly. That was a quote, which is why I had to. Dermot's opponents were vile traitors, but they weren't savages, basically. And the English were there to help him impose order upon his unruly people. My point here is not, I could go on and on, but my point here is not that the invading English were some sort of wonderful multiculturalists, all right? It's simply that they must have held more nuanced and pragmatic views of the Irish than one would guess from just looking at Gerald of Wales or Alexander III or Gervase of Tilbury. In fact, at least the first generation of the conquest is inexplicable if we subscribe to a binary view of colonist versus native. It simply doesn't work that way. Instead, I think we should focus on what nearly every source does focus on, and that is this desire to impose order upon a politically fragmented island. So, because nearly every source says that the English went there to impose order, we might expect to find English-style administration from the very beginning of the conquest. But of course we don't. Because Henry II was only there over one winter and then had to leave for various other means that I don't have time to get into. So instead, he devolved authority in Ireland to his magnates, to the main barons there. He provided them with speculative lordships and then allowed them to pretty much get on with realizing those lordships in much the same way that the Welsh marcher lords were set loose in Wales in the reign of Rufus and Henry I. This relative independence gave the new colonial lords freedom to reach accommodation with the Irish, which they were forced to do. And so although the very act of conquest implies a disdain for those being conquered, in this and in other ways, the incoming English displayed a pragmatic attitude towards the Irish. So for instance, Hugh de Lacy, who was the Mortimer's predecessor in Meath, and the subject of a wonderful book over here, had been a moderately powerful baron along the Welsh March, holding lands, as you can see there. He held Ludlow, Webley, Uis Lacy, as well as some lands in Normandy. In 1172, he was granted the old Irish kingdom of Meath, or we say Meath, as Murchad O'Neill Shockland had held it, and basically told to go and conquer it. Now, Hugh was very successful. He combined brutality and guile to realize his grant. But he also worked within the confines of settler lordship. He needed a local labor force to make his lordship profitable. And so Gerald of Wales tells us that Hugh, there's a picture of Hugh de Lacy from Gerald's work. Hugh went to great trouble to conciliate those, that is the Irish, who had been conquered by others and forcibly ejected from their lands. And thus he restored the countryside to its rightful cultivators and brought back cattle to pastures which had formerly been deserted. So when he had won their support, he enticed them to his side still further by his mild rule and by making agreements on which they could rely. And finally, when they had been hemmed in by castles and gradually subdued, he compelled them to obey the laws. And here, stay. In addition to reaching accommodation with the Irish of their own lordships, these English lords also had to reach accommodation with the Irish kingdoms that surrounded them, and so they could impose their will upon them or negotiate. There were several people, including Hugh de Lacy, but also lords in Ulster, Munster, and Leinster, who married into local Irish dynasties. And so at his death in 1186, the Irish Annals of Loch Cay say of Hugh de Lacy that, quote, he was king, where is it? All right, he was king of Meath and Breffni and Aurelia, and so that's Meath, Breffni is here, and Aurelia is County Louth there, so king of all this territory. It was to him that the tribute of Connaught was paid, so here, and it was he that won all Ireland for the foreigners. Neither from the Shannon to the sea was full of castles and of foreigners. Now this entrenched power was eventually threatened by the notoriously willful King John. Now, the great turning point in John's reign, I would say, and perhaps a huge turning point in British and Irish history, was his loss of Normandy in 1204. The heart of the Angevin Empire had been torn away, and John spared no expense to fund its recapture. In England, the 10 furious years of his financial rapacity ended in baronial rebellion and Magna Carta. In Ireland, he tried to introduce the mechanisms for revenue extraction that he enjoyed in England to a frontier that was not used to that type of arrangement. This sparked a baronial rebellion of its own in 1207, when his administrators ran roughshod over the seigneurial rights of William de Brews in Munster. And for the most part, that rebellion was successful. John had to back down a bit, but he regrouped And in 1210, he led an expedition to Ireland and swept all before him. He gathered together the Irish and the English and decreed at the end of that English law was to be recognized throughout Ireland. He had already started to centralize his administration on Dublin. In 1204, he had ordered the construction of a strong castle at Dublin to be the administrative and judicial centre of Ireland. He had from this point, the shires, Ireland began to be shired, and they spread throughout most of the country by the mid-13th century, or at least the south and the east of the country by the mid-13th century. Those sheriffs in those local shires accounted not only for the profits of their shires, but they also accounted for tribute from regional Irish lords who had to pay the king tribute. All of this was funneled to Dublin, and you can see here, well, you would if you're eagle-eyed, you can see here a depiction of the Exchequer in Dublin from a 15th century book, the Red Book of the Irish Exchequer, and you can see where the Exchequer gets its name, or anyway, the checker pattern on the table there. He also centralized the minting of coins to Dublin, and here you can see John's Irish coins that have his portrait on the obverse, his device, which is a crescent moon and a star on the reverse, and you can tell that these are Irish coins because of the triangle. Do you see the triangle there? That's how you can tell that it's Irish coinage, because it's got that. From this point, because English law had been exported to Ireland, the Irish judiciary started to move closer and closer to the English model. I mean, there were always going to be differences, and certainly by the later Middle Ages, there were differences. But from the beginning, it was based on an ideal form of the English judiciary, with ultimate appellate jurisdiction residing in England. So there was some independence. You could have some local variations, but the appellate court was in England. Similar process happened with the Irish Chancery from 1232, so much after John's reign, where there was some local autonomy. There was a Great Seal of Ireland, but it was ultimately controlled by England. And this is why I can talk about a colony, because it was governmentally dependent upon England. It was devolved, but still governmentally dependent. However, as willful and as centrist, I guess, as John was, he couldn't do all of this alone. He needed the acquiescence of the local lords in Ireland. So in 1204, he set up a committee of local administrators and magnates to help him push through some of these initiatives. Some are listed there. In the interest of time, because I've forgotten to time myself, we'll move on. The point here, where is it? Is that neither the magnates, the Irish magnates, who were used by John and English kings, nor the king himself behaved wholly, let's say, public-mindedly. Yes, there was cooperation in Ireland, but there was also factionalism promoted between the great magnates there. So, for instance, King John set, in order to pursue whatever ends he wanted to do, John, and then later Henry III, could set one family up against another. And in the early 13th century, the two great families that display this the best are the Lacys and the Marshalls. So the Lacys were elevated to the earldom of Ulster, and they held Meath. The Marshalls inherited Strongbow's lordship of Leinster and also the earldom of Pembroke. So the Marshalls controlled the southern Irish Sea from Leinster and Pembroke, and the Lacys controlled, if not all of the northern Irish Sea, at least part of it. And so rebellions periodically erupted, which pitted the Lacys against the Marshalls, and they moved from the Welsh March to Ireland and back again. And it just, one of the reasons that Irish history is so important is because these people thought in terms that was greater than England. They didn't stop at the boundaries of England, and so rebellions in England could spill over into Ireland and vice versa. I'll skip that. So I will return to the beginning or the end to Roger Mortimer once again in Ireland. So when we last left him, he had chased the Scots back up into Ulster, and hooray, Ireland was saved, sort of. A lot of narratives end there and see it as the beginning of the end for the Scots in Ireland, and maybe it was. But Roger still had a lot to do to preserve the English position. And the mechanisms, the way he went about that shows a lot about how the currents of Irish politics could be managed by those at the head of the administration. So for instance, he brought his own followers with him, which made them royal soldiers as well as Mortimer soldiers. He used the power invested in him as the king's lieutenant to attack his own rebellious vassals in Meath, the Lacys, who were cadet branch, who may have harbored some designs on Meath itself. He attacked them, he went after them. They were accused of having invited the Bruces into Ireland. They were accused of having abandoned Mortimer at the Battle of Kells, which he lost, and then guiding the Scots through Ireland. They were acquitted by a court, but then the Mortimer called them to Trim to enter the king's peace again, and they refused. They killed his messenger, and so he went, unfurled banners with the royal army, and attacked them, exiled them. They were gone. So he was able to use royal authority to settle the score in Meath. But he also had to recognize that there were areas of Ireland without his control. So in Munster, he had to compromise with the colonial community. He couldn't just impose his will. And he agreed to pardon some crimes if they would just stop fighting. Even within his own lordship of Dunamace, that had been overrun by the Imuerda, the O'Moores, making it no longer viable. It cost too much money for him to actually defend. It cost more money than it was worth. So instead, he made the head of the family, Leishach O'Muerda, his guardian of Dunamace. He basically just gave it over to the people who had been overrunning it, because that way he retained some sort of control while still allowing the reality of politics on the ground. And then finally, he attempted to bring English law to all of the Gaelic Irish, to at least address one of their greatest criticisms of English rule. I don't know if the later speakers will talk about what might have approached legal apartheid in Ireland, but English law was denied to a great number of Gaelic Irish, which meant not only that they were not punished in the same way in the courts, it also meant they couldn't hold positions of authority within the administration. So he at least tried to address those problems. He wasn't successful, but he tried. So my point today, and thank you for paying attention, has been to try and provide some context for the currents of politics that cut across the national divide. They were very difficult to manage. This was not a centrally driven polity like we might see in England. It was a much more rough and ready situation, and the rhetoric that we sometimes read didn't always match up with the reality on the ground. Thank you very much for your attention.
Taken across the Irish Sea, will we ever